Good morning. Welcome to the 35th Annual Welty Symposium, which is made possible from a generous grant from the Robert M. Herron Foundation. I am T.K. Lee, or you may know me as Chris, or the guy who recently got tenure, but regardless, I am thrilled. Thank you. I mean, brag when you can, right? It's a captive audience and all, but I'm thrilled to be here regardless to introduce the first four authors of our morning session here at the Welty Symposium, and from a stellar lineup of writers that are all gathered here this weekend to share from their latest works. Following each author, we will hold a brief Q&A with the time that remains, and so feel free to save your questions until then, but not at the end. You can do it per author. But since time is of the essence, we shall get to the reason we are here, which are these authors. And that means starting with our first one, which is Lee Durkee. Lee Durkee is the author of the novels Rides of the Midway and The Last Taxi Driver, named a best book of 2021 in Ireland, France, and America. In April of 2023, Scribner Books published Stalking, Shakespeare, a memoir about his bizarre 20-year obsession trying to find lost portraits of William Shakespeare and get them x-rayed. His stories and essays have appeared in Harper's Magazine, The Sun, The Best of the Oxford American, Zoetrope, Garden and Gun, Tin House, and Mississippi Noir. He lives in North Mississippi, and his latest book, the reason we are here, Stalking Shakespeare, is a bizarre and surprisingly moving blend of biography, art history, and madness that the Washington Post calls gripping, poignant, and the New York Times praises as wickedly entertaining. Durkee has penned a journey that will forever change the way you look at one of history's greatest cultural and literary icons. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the stage Lee Durkee.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm not really a morning person myself, and I've been up since 4 a.m. So it's sort of a strange experiment, conglomeration of caffeine, Adderall, beta blocker, and hotel food, breakfast food in front of you. It could be a horrible disaster. Is it too loud, too soft? Can you hear? All right, I'd love to see those thumbs up. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Kendall, for having me back again for the third time. And thank you, Katie, for a wonderful keynote reading last night, which was just fabulous. When I first came here 20-something odd years ago, I was a young erstwhile debut novelist and the world was my oyster. Since then, things, writing is not always what you want it to be. After that debut novel, I went 20 years without publishing anything, not a single short story, not a poem, not an essay, not a haiku, nothing. And 20 years is a long time. During that time, and part of the reason I didn't get anything published was I had become obsessed with Shakespeare's portraits and started a blog about them. And this all began about the time the internet came on into the world. And I started realizing there was just something called an online gallery. And these online galleries displayed portraits in British museums that not only ones that were on display, but portraits that had been hidden in storerooms for centuries, ones that no normal people had ever seen. And I became obsessed with trying to find a lost portrait of William Shakespeare because I knew I had a huge advantage over anybody else previously looking for Shakespeare because of these online museums. And the reason I became addicted to this was because of my blog, Curious Portraits of Dead Elizabethans, which you have to remember blogs were, when they were new, they were fascinating. I could go online, I could write an article about a portrait, and somebody from Africa or Brazil would comment on it. And that was just magical to me. I would have that kind of feedback. So I really dug in and got lost inside this search. And not only did I have an advantage of having the internet and technology on my side in the search for a lost portrait of Shakespeare, I had strategy. I had noticed that in the portraits purported to be Shakespeare, and most of these portraits are being championed by Stratford-upon-Avon and the tourist industry in England. Shakespeare kept getting prettier year by year, decade by decade, century by century. And so I decided to explore and investigate the candidate portraits that nobody really wanted to be our soul of the ages, the hideous Shakespeares, the ugly ones that had been neglected and not explored. So that also, I felt like, gave me an advantage. And as you can see from this fellow behind me, that Shakespeare has not always been so beautiful. This is the Drew Shoot engraving from the 1623 first folio. And it's our only portrait of Shakespeare that seems somewhat contemporary. It came out about 7 years after his death in 1623 as part of the first folio, which was sort of the collected Shakespeare, a fabulous endeavor that really deified Shakespeare for the first time. But the strange portrait, this engraving was chosen that nobody really likes. This is not the Shakespeare anybody wants. But it's all we had. And this was Shakespeare for quite a long time. And all these portraits have come along since then and been championed as Shakespeare painted from life. The assumption here is that the Drew Shoot engraving was modeled on a portrait of Shakespeare painted from life. But that portrait has since been lost. And the search for the template portrait for this engraving has been going on for 400 years and played a big part in wrecking my life. Something else I should also tell you about the Hollowell Phillips first unique proof. You can see it, well, it's kind of hidden, not ideal there. Oh, well. The Hollowell Phillips unique proof was one printed copy made from a separate plate of the same, of a similar engraving, but it was done in a much more professional, refined method. And for some reason, it was abandoned, and they downgraded a new plate to mass produce this image that nobody likes. So if we're looking for the most authentic portrait of Shakespeare, that'll be him over there. And this portrait, I read about it, the Hollowell Phillips unique proof, in a book written in the 19th century. And then I went trying to find it. And eventually I discovered that it had been purchased by the Volger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. And so I contacted them and asked them if they had it. And they weren't sure if they did or not, and said, well, we'll get back to you on that. And eventually they wrote back and they said, yeah, we do have that. And I was excited. I said, well, can you please send me a photograph of this? And they said, well, we'd never gotten around to photographing it. And I thought, wow, here's the most authentic portrait of Shakespeare in existence, kept at the Volger Shakespeare Library, and they've never photographed it. So I had to pay them to photograph it. They sent it to me. And now I had the most authentic portrait of Shakespeare to use as I went riffling through all of these online galleries, looking for lost portraits of Shakespeare, and especially for ugly ones. As you can see here, the lovely portrait over here might be the original to the famous Chandos portrait of Shakespeare. It actually has an argument to being Shakespeare ad vivum, painted from life. The real word is vivum, but I refuse to say ad vivum. It just sounds funny. I say ad vivum. And the other one is the buttery portrait of Shakespeare. My personal favorite. He looks a little bit inbred and might be actually somebody from the Habsburg dynasty and not Shakespeare at all. But both these portraits have arguments that they are Shakespeare painted from life. They're not incredibly strong arguments, but they're intriguing. And yet these portraits have never been x-rayed. They've never been infrareded so that we can see beneath the paint. And the reason for that is they're kept at the Volger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., which has a trustee policy that says we're not going to x-ray any portrait unless there's a public outcry to do so. Now, as you can imagine, there's not a great deal of public outcries about Shakespeare portraits rattling the corridors of Washington, D.C. So they've only x-rayed 2 of their portraits, yet they've collected what I'm pretty sure is the largest collection of Shakespeare portraits in the world. And a research library won't let you research them. If you have a portrait and you treat it with infrared technology, infrared reflectography, what that does is it shoots an IR beam of light through the paint layers, and that light is absorbed by carbon underdrawings. So you get to see the original drawings that were created the painting. So you get to see the first draft. If you could imagine having a magic book of Macbeth, the play, and that play showed you every draft Shakespeare went through writing Macbeth, but it also showed you all the censorship involved in Macbeth, which might be considerable. It might be a good reason it's the shortest play in the canon. That would give you an idea of what spectral technologies can do with portrait. X-rays can reveal under portraits. They can reveal extirpations, what has been scraped out, and they can reveal what has been added on. So we can see all the censorships in the evolution of the portrait. So it's fascinating. So I became very adept at annoying curators into x-raying and infrareding their portraits. And this can cost thousands of dollars for them to do. So it took me years. I would badger a curator over any one particular portrait for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Finally, they would agree to do it. Then I'd have to wait another year to get the result of the x-ray. And quite often, the result was disappointing because x-rays are hit and miss, IRs are hit and miss. You never know if you're going to find anything at all. I talked to one curator, I badgered him so bad, he finally hauled his portrait, an Elizabethan portrait, down to a local medical clinic and x-rayed it there. And I didn't know that's what he was doing. That's very damaging for the pigment. He shouldn't have done that at all. And when I got the x-ray, it was just a mismatch, useless x-ray that I had waited 4 years for, and it was pointless. So there's a lot of disappointment, a lot of anticlimax involved in all of this. To show you a little bit of what spectral technologies can do. Sorry, I should be going through this in a better order. This is a portrait of Queen Elizabeth that's kept at the National Portrait Gallery in London, MPG 200. It was painted around, I think, 1580, 1585. Right about the time, bear in mind with the Elizabethans, there was no such thing as free speech, and all art was censored heavily. Shakespeare complained about it, art made tongue-tied by authority. And so paintings were overpainted, they were scraped, they were censored, and you were not allowed to paint a provocative portrait of Queen Elizabeth. Now here we have a portrait, and as you can see to your right, there's another portrait underneath it. Is starting to show through the pigment after 400 years, okay? Which to me is fascinating. The whole idea that there is a portrait underneath the original portrait, I find that pretty neat. One of the most famous portraits of Shakespeare, the flower portrait, it has a portrait of Jesus, Jesus, John the Baptist, and Mary underneath it, an Italian portrait. And we had no idea that was there until it was x-rayed. But this portrait, if you look at Queen Elizabeth, you'll see she's holding a bouquet of primroses, which are her favorite flowers. But that's not what she was originally holding. What she was originally holding, which we see with a IR reflectogram, infrared light, is a very occult image of a green serpent, right? Now, one thing they don't want you to know about the Elizabethans is they were neck deep in the occult. That's something you don't see in all these Shakespeare movies, you know. They don't touch upon that, but they were occultists. And Neoplatonism was the name of the occult religion that Francis Yates has argued was practiced by Queen Elizabeth herself, and this portrait might seem to support that. So this is the kind of thing you would see when you would X-ray and infrared a portrait. Now, what got me in this whole game was portrait miniatures. And these two are two of my favorite. The one on your left, Unknown Man Standing Before a Wall of Fire, was painted by Nicholas Hilliard, Queen Elizabeth's court painter and a great artist who painted everything in small, as they called it. And back then, this was considered the highest art form except for poetry. Painting in large, it was like anybody can do that. But painting in miniature, and these were about the size of a turkey egg, and they were worn on hats, on lapels. They were worn as feudal badges of loyalty. These were the high, very, very high art form. And when I bought a book of these, I came upon this portrait and I found out this guy was unidentified. And it bothered me. I wanted to know who he was. And this is really the genesis of my whole book, is trying to identify unknown courtiers, unknown Elizabethan courtiers, to find out who they were, because to me, it matters. In the book I had about this, written by Professor Arbach on Hilliard's portraits, he stated outright, she stated outright, it doesn't matter who this subject is. It's a brilliant portrait, one of Hilliard's most famous, but she didn't think it mattered who the sitter was. I thought it mattered a lot. And I spent decades trying to figure out who this strange fellow was. On the guy on your right, another unknown courtier, also painted by the great Nicholas Hilliard, wearing a sugarloaf hat and an Italian cutwork fall collar. You can see his perm. He's got a perm. You know from the perm itself, that means it was painted in 1588. It's called the Armada perm. Fashion was a religion back then. So if you see any courtier with a perm, you just think 1588. Leslie Hodson, Professor Leslie Hodson at Harvard, wrote an entire book arguing that this portrait was Shakespeare painted from life. Now, there's never been a portrait of Shakespeare painted from life that has stood the test of time. There's been a lot of candidate portraits, and they've all been scandalously debunked, really deliciously debunked. The scandals behind the portraits, which kind of fill my book, are inexplicable and mind-blowing. Everything from portrait switchery to murders to portraits that maybe should not have been debunked, but were being debunked for odd reasons that might have to do with portrait ownership and money and the authorship debate. And the authorship debate is something else I delve into in my book. But I got interested in this portrait over there as well. And eventually it was my interest in portrait miniatures that turned me on to the whole world of Shakespeare portraits. My original interest was the Elizabethans themselves. I had a really good professor when I was at the University of Arkansas in Shakespeare, and he was passionate not just about Shakespeare, but about the entire tribe of Elizabethans. And so my interest started with that time period and the people who lived there. And they were marvelous people. They were courageous. Life was cheap. They were, the nobles were incredibly brilliant, overeducated. They had memory systems that made them so much smarter than us that they would not be impressed with us at all. And they were also Machiavellian, mean-spirited at times, ruthless, and really filthy. Their literature is dirty as it can be. as was Shakespeare's. There's another thing we don't dwell on, is how truly filthy Shakespeare was. And he was, in a really good, funny way. And we also miss a lot of his puns and everything today. We don't realize, for instance, just how filthy Romeo and Juliet is as a play. And it really is. It should be taught that way. I'm going to read, let me see if there's anything I should be showing you here in my. Oh, okay. This is the Cobb portrait of Shakespeare, which I call Spongeworthy Shakespeare. The Stratford Birthplace Trust is basically in charge of promoting Shakespeare, and Stanley Wells is their chairman. And this is their pet portrait. They want you to believe this is Shakespeare, even though hardly any scholar in the world agrees with them. And 90% of the scholars will argue this is Sir Thomas Overbury. They don't care because they want this Shakespeare because he looks like a soap opera doctor. And he's beautiful. And this is what people want with Shakespeare. They want this lovely, handsome Shakespeare. And there's really no indication that Shakespeare looked like this at all. And there's very little indication this portrait is attached to Shakespeare. It was found in a collection owned by the third Earl of Southampton, who was supposedly Shakespeare's fair youth and patron. So therefore it's Shakespeare. And that is, of course, a very weak argument. So yeah. And finally, to go back to my first portrait, Unknown Man Before a Wall of Fire. The person on your right is Nathan Field. He was a famous Shakespearean actor and was mentioned in Shakespeare's first folio as one of the original performers of Shakespeare's plays. He was known and revered for his jealousy. He was very fiery, and he was said to have performed Othello so well because of his own personal jealousy. He was in love with an earl's wife whom he impregnated. And one of the epigraphs about him was that so overwhelming was the heart of his passion that the last line of the epigram laments, "Poor fields will burn even in the month of May." And you can see the similarities here. They're both in their linen shirts, etc. There are only two courtiers I found posing in their linen shirts. And so I wonder, and I hope that this is actually Nathan Field, the actor. It may or may not be, we don't know for certain. But this is the kind of thing I was just obsessed with for years. I'm going to read a passage from the book now and then take some questions afterwards. It's not a dry academic book. It's a personal memoir, incredibly personal at some points. And I tried to write it in the style of the Elizabethans, which means flamboyant, filthy, bawdy. So I tried to write a book they would like in their style. I don't know whether I succeeded or not, but the passage I'm about to read takes place during my last year in Vermont. I moved to Vermont when I was very briefly married and then very quickly divorced. And I had to spend the next 17 years there until my son turned 18. I'm from South Mississippi, and I didn't even know what seasonal depression was when I moved there, but boy, did I find out. This is my last winter in Vermont before I just couldn't take it anymore. My son had just turned 18 by the end of this passage. My son was raised among hideous Elizabethans. Every weekend when he arrived at my lake camp, we'd fire up the game cube to play a soccer game that allowed us to design our own virtual squads. I always fielded a team of grotesque English courtiers my son came to recognize via their caricatures and dribbling skills. He knew Burleigh and Walsingham to be no-nonsense defenders, whereas the more exalted lick-click gulls, such as Phil Sidney, Tommy Nash, and Kit Marlowe, wreaked havoc on the attacking half. Among holding midfielders, I fancied John Dee and Chuck Blunt, with the gnomish Robbie Cecil sweeping. Shakespeare and all his monstrous incarnations guarded the gold mouth. But since these avatars could only be created masculine, my most noxious player was always my number 9 striker, Queen Elizabeth I, who roamed the pitch like a ghoulish, flame-haired Leo Messi. During those 18 pitiless winters I endured in Vermont, my son Hayden was the only person who shared my fascination with Shakespeare portraits. Upon arriving each Friday, he'd ask about the latest photograph purchased, our swan unearthed. We'd examine JPEGs together while listening to whatever rapper had captivated him that week. We traded obsessions. We traded poets. One of the great things about being a divorced dad, aside from having no legal rights whatsoever, is getting to follow your ex-wife from town to town every time she moves or remarries. Eventually, I had to follow Ella to the town of Montpelier, Vermont, the smallest state capital in America, an extremely wholesome place gutted of young people. Montpelier proved comically picturesque. Even the local gun store looked quaint. My son, a teenager now, had better things to do than hang out with his dad on weekends. I'd never been so bored, so lonely, so reluctantly wholesome. My life felt like a Twilight Zone episode in which a man awakens trapped inside a Norman Rockwell painting. Montpelier, I couldn't help but think, would have made the perfect setting for a horror movie. With not much else to do, I burrowed into my Shakespeare portraits and soon hit upon the perfectly psychotic way to compare their facial anomalies. What I did, I sized up my JPEGs, inserted them into slideshows, then staggered these presentations so that my 3 monitors juxtaposed random images. That done, I sat in front of this cockpit like Neo downloading Kung Fu. After a while, all I had to do was close my eyes to watch the barrage of deformed Elizabethan faces unfold. In this manner, the winters began blending together. I have little memory of any other season there. One particularly frigid night found me sitting alone in my condo, sipping a glass of cheap Merlot under the seance glow of 3 candles set along the coffee table. There was a lamp next to the couch I kept flicking on and off like a psycho killer might, while staring up at the framed print of a folding portrait known historically as Queen Elizabeth in Strange Fantastic Habit, a painting attributed to Marcus Geerhardt the Younger and dated circa 1600. The portrait's conceit came from Ovid and portrayed Queen Elizabeth as the goddess Diana, her go-to mythological double. But the most striking detail about the portrait was its depiction of England's virgin queen as undeniably pregnant. Sir Roy Strong once called the painting the most complicated of Elizabethan allegorical portraits. Such a picture, he added, could not have been conceived as anything other than a major statement. While gazing into this portrait that night, I left the lamp off too long and fell asleep. With my wine glass lagging into my lap, I dreamt about Queen Elizabeth in all her glory, in which methought I was among her court, dressed in my best jerkin and slops, an outrageous cartwheel ruff circling my neck, inside a grand ballroom teeming with beautified courtiers, the Earls of Essex and Southampton, the frizzy-haired Mary Sidney, the skull-capped John Dee, the looming Robert Topcliffe, and even wee Robert Cecil, the crooked-backed secretary who in his own treacherous way ruled over them all. Only Shakespeare seemed to be missing as the couples performed that annoying palm-mating dance you see in every movie about the Tudors. I know you all, I thought, the intelligencers, bit players, torturers, thieves, and sorcerers. I knew their ruffs, perms, beards, cuffs, and jewelries, their wants and weaknesses, their shadows, scars, and syphilitic ears. I knew what virtues and horrors these creatures were capable of. Behind the one smile of Lord Burleigh lay a moat of corpses, I knew their shifting alliances and how they all thwarted against Robert Dudley, the Queen's longtime lover, said to employ an Italian apothecary for poison on demand. I knew the dancing courtiers by their portraits and by their body counts and by the characters they'd inspired in plays. And I walked among them, recalling their poems, philosophies, trifles, essays, and pamphlets, all the while trying to grasp the elusive Elizabethan mindset, which at times seemed to me void of conscience, a court filled with a psychosis of fantasticos who might have left no ear unfilled or throat unslit had it not been for one courtier's invention of the inward spiraling soliloquy, that evolutionary reminder that we are all cousins in suffering. I awoke with a wine-soaked crotch, refilled my glass, and at that moment noticed something impossible about the portrait in front of me. What I noticed was titillating and resolute. Illuminated by candlelight alone, the Queen's bathing gown had dissolved into a gauze that left her naked and exposed. Yet a moment later, after I flicked on the lamp again, the same gown, that quick, was no longer transparent, and the Queen was once again respectable. I kept turning the lamp on and off to test my sanity. What I beheld seemed indisputable, and I began to wonder if I were the first person to notice the Queen's nakedness since Mr. Edison had invented the light bulb. I also began to wonder if I were losing my mind or becoming a fetishist. Not only was the Queen naked, but this nakedness mirrored the portrait's conceit, in which the goddess Diana was spotted bathing nude by the doom hunter Actaeon. Here is an impossibility, I told myself. Here is a portrait that defies logic, that cannot exist, and yet there she stands as if alive. I grinned and raised my wine glass to the Queen. I am the only person to have seen you naked, I slurred. Then, while draining that glass, I recalled the fate of Actaeon, the hunter who had spied a goddess naked, after which his own hounds had ripped him apart like a baited chimp. It gave me pause, I'll admit. That was the winter I fell in love for the first time since my divorce. There was a woman I'd become close friends with. One night after an argument with her boyfriend, she called me up wanting to have drinks and later started kissing on me. Nothing much happened except all hell broke loose inside my heart. Apparently, I'd been in love for some time, and the moment we kissed, all that denial met the wrecking ball, and I became a slave to someone who was only kissing me to get revenge on a wayward boyfriend. They quickly reconciled, and my life became unbearable. Unrequited love, however idealized by French troubadours, is torture. And small-town heartbreak is the cruelest form of crucifixion. Every time you step outside, you hope to glimpse your beloved, and in a town this tiny, you often do. So there's hardly a moment's reprieve from love sickness. You go to a bar and your eyes roam the table. You enter the post office, the library, the grocery store, and it never stops. Every window becomes a Norman Rockwell painting you scour for the woman who doesn't love you. One evening, I took a copy of the I Ching off my bookshelf and asked it some questions about the woman I was in love with, and tossed some pennies and pondered some hexagrams. And within a week, I was addicted to the I Ching. Then I started writing love poetry and would occasionally email a poem to the woman I loved. It was insanity. And anyway, what kind of fool thinks a woman can be wooed with poetry? Maybe in Shakespeare's time, but these days, if you send a woman love poems, she assumes you're going to murder her. Somehow not realizing this, love is the purest madness. I kept emailing my insipid poems until she finally wrote back and asked me to please stop. Reading that email stripped me bare. Suddenly I saw myself in all my feral patheticness and became so ashamed I stopped going downtown entirely. How many hundreds of times did I ask the I Ching if she were thinking about me? To escape that compulsion, I took long walks in the woods where I cursed the frozen landscape and flipped off crows and began to pick out the best tree to hang myself from. The woods I roamed those days were strung with corpses, And in this Rockwell shadow box I'd created out of madness, love, Adderall, and bad poetry. Every dangling corpse I saw was my own. Suicidal thoughts can be addictive, not to mention genetic. And I spent a lot of time that winter recalling my grandfather and father and their sordid deaths by noose and pill. Until finally one evening, I took a forlorn drive that ended at the gun shop at the edge of town. A gun shop is painted by Norman Rockwell, and sat behind the wheel watching the giant snowflakes fall for I don't know how long. Before driving back to my condo and walking into my office, where I sat in my ergonomic chair beneath my Manson family of Shakespeare portraits. I was still sitting there the next morning, but by then 2 empty wine bottles had joined the still life. As sunlight filled the room, I started spinning slow circles in my chair. The office wheeling around me resembled a halfway home for punch-drunk poets, eyes corkscrewed, cheeks scarred, ears cauliflowered, noses boxered, so many mutts, the catfish and drift-eyed, the banana-nosed, poxed, acne, the apoplectic, a police lineup of jostled bards. All those winters, they had been my confidants, my drinking buddies, my band of deformed brothers. When I planted a foot to halt my chair's spin, the office continued to gyroscope around me as I stood and one by one took down all my Shakespeares, the whole bedraggled army, scraping off their tape, prying out their thumbtacks. Then I stacked them into a cardboard box, carried them out into the snow, threw them into the back seat of my car, and drove them home to Mississippi. Thank you. Kendall, do we have time for questions? 5 minutes? Okay, thank you. Any quick questions? Katie? Yes. Yeah. Well, once you got accepted, COVID, and COVID did my young new editor, straight quit. So I did an editor, and then the book was being printed in China because we had so many places in illustration. And he got to wait a year and worked psychologically for a year, but the situation kind of had to improve, so we waited another year. So I had to work full-time the next 2 years on this book. And by the time it was published, you ever seen a dog that's been beaten and raise your hand? That's how I feel about Shakespeare right now. And of course, anybody now you may have been thinking about Shakespeare, like put an email, anything with Shakespeare. Yeah, I full of my thought, seriously, that is. And it has dozens and dozens of portraits I became obsessed with over the days of the book. Most of them they require lots of side-by-side comparisons and things like that. So the blog is actually please my favorite writing in my life. And I don't want to have I was sailing with curious what maybe not more question. Here. And yes, it's fine with how Mr. Holloway puts himself speculated that it was just too refined for mass production and they dominated it simply so they reproduced part. I can't remember how many copies of this so that's one theory. I don't know if you noticed, it was clear and honest at the same product. So it is a bit of an issue why it's downgraded to a little more disappointing and it didn't know the image from almost a kind of caricature instead of the most soulful appearance. It's a vision. There's so many issues about everyone. Anyway,
Thank you again, Lee. Our next author this morning is Maurice Carlos Ruffin. Maurice Carlos Ruffin is the recipient of the 2023 Louisiana Writer Award, and his book, The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, was the official book chosen as focus for the 2023 One Book, One New Orleans. The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You was a New York Times Editor's Choice, a finalist for the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence, longlisted for the Story Prize, and was selected to represent Louisiana at the 2023 National Book Festival. Ruffin previously was a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and the Penn America Open Book Prize for his first book, We Cast a Shadow. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Oxford American, and 400 Souls, a community history of African America, among others. A New Orleans native, Ruffin, currently a professor of creative writing at Louisiana State University, was the 2020-2021 Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi, and a co-curator of the Read My World Literary Festival in Amsterdam in 2017, and a contributor again in 2022. Of the Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, Kiesi Lehman wrote, "What he is doing in these short stories is breathtaking. This is wonder writing." Let's welcome to the stage now, then, Maurice Carlos Ruffin.
I gotta stay high till I die. What's up, y'all? Let me see. Let me say first thank you to Kendall and everybody who brought us all out for this event. Where do I want to start today? So I'm from New Orleans, and being from New Orleans, we always have music going constantly. So I'm gonna vibe for a second. Y'all can like chat amongst yourselves. Let me find some good music to play. See what else we got here. Yeah, this will work. Something mysterious. Is this screen still working? Thank you. Takes a minute to heat up. All right, let's try this again. Good morning, everybody. How you doing? I'm Maurice Carlos Ruffin. I'm a writer from New Orleans. I teach fiction writing. I love music. I love food. I love the South. I mean, that's weird to say that, right? I love the South, right? I'm the author of 3 books. This is the first book, We Cast a Shadow. This is the second book, The Ones Who Will Say They Love You. And this is the third book, The American Daughters. Was that a clap? What was that, a clap? I'll take a clap. I'll do a clap. Yeah. No, but seriously, how many writers are out there in the audience? Come on, I know some of you young people are writing stuff. I see some hands. Put your hands way up. Writers, put your hands way up. Thank you for that. There we go, everybody. That's what I'm talking about. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So look, one thing the reason why I'm asking that question is because if I ask you like, who wants to be a lawyer? I'm actually a lawyer myself. Or like, who wants to be rich one day? People are like, that fast, right? But writers are always like the friends like, put your arm up, that kind of thing. Let me ask you this, who likes to read? All right, now we're cooking. Who likes to write? All right, that means you're a writer. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. And the reason why I'm asking that is because I think that many of us don't understand that if you actually like to read and you actually like to write, that means you're actually a very rare person. Not everybody enjoys reading, and even fewer people enjoy writing. If you enjoy both of those things and you actually write stuff, that means you can change the world. I was the kind of nerd who used to volunteer at the library, like when I was in high school. Like I would go to the actual library and like take a stack of books on a cart and put them on the shelves for like hours at a time. I like looking at books. I like how they look. I like how they feel. And so it was only a matter of time before I started writing my own stories. Now, when I started writing my own stories, they were very, very bad stories. I mean, they were just terrible. I would like read, like I say like to my friends, hey, look, let's go up to my house, writing this story. Let's check this out for a second. Start reading the story. They looking down like this the whole time. I'm like, okay, probably not so good, right? But guess what happens? If you keep on writing over time, the stories get good. So I'm going to read a story, and you can tell me if you like it or not, or it can like just be like really respectful and be like, don't just like, you can look down. Let's see what happens. This is my short story collection that they're actually selling out there. And there's a story in here that is called Mercury Forges. Now, I mentioned a second ago that I'm actually a lawyer. I practiced law for 16 years, and it was a very interesting job to have. What made it really cool was the people I met. And one day I had a case. Okay, I'll just say this out loud. I was representing the bad guys. I was a law firm lawyer. So like our job was like representing like oil companies and gun companies and cigarette companies and like just all the bad guys. I didn't like doing it, but I learned a lot. So one of the cases we had, it turned out that Shell, Nick and Hamlet, Shell had poisoned the neighborhood in New Orleans. And so the people in the neighborhood had filed a lawsuit, and they were each getting like $200, not a lot of money. I was a kid lawyer, and so they had to come to me, and I would like fill a document out and like put a stamp on it. If they took that document, they can get their check for like $200. One of the guys that walked up to me, his name was Mercury Forges. Mercury Forges. He gives me his license. And I'm like, that's quite a name. I say, where does it come from? He says, I have no idea. And so being a writer, I decided to write a story about a man named Mercury Forges. So this is that story. Mercury Forges. My job was to make sure Mercury Forges didn't escape. He was a stocky black guy in for drugs and guns. And he'd gotten out of Orleans Parish prison twice. And no one knew how he did it. The funny thing is, both times he escaped jail, he got captured within a few blocks. I get turned around when I get out there, Deputy Benoit, Mercury said once. But I'll get free for good. Just you watch. When the hurricane hit and flooded the whole city, we brought the inmates out to the Broad Street overpass. Now, I wasn't too panicked because, see, my family and my fellow deputies, they were all safe. So we could do our work without worrying about it too much. Mercury snuck away as soon as I turned my back on him. Wouldn't you know it? That was Mercury. He was in a pirogue. He was in a little boat about 5 blocks away, and he was bobbing like an apple. I ran along that overpass, and I climbed down some scaffolding to his boat, which I grabbed like that. You see, we hadn't cuffed those guys, those inmates. It'd be too hard to move from place to place with all this flooding if they had handcuffs on. Mercury, where do you think you're going? I asked. I had a hand on my gun, waiting for something to pop off. I gotta find Humanity Street, man, he said. That's where my pops lives. Now, I knew Mercury's dad, and he was a good guy. He brought lunch plates to us deputies every day. I liked his dad, but that shouldn't have mattered at the moment. I can't really tell you why I didn't make him bring us back to the detention area. And after a while, we floated up to a yellow house where the flood water was up to the awning. Mercury yanked a metal pole from the water, and he broke through the attic window, and he climbed in. And I heard this shuffling inside the attic of that house. And I wondered if I should go in after him, if I should chase him into that attic of that house. You see, I figured this is part of his big getaway plan. But soon, he grunted out of that window and pulled his father's body out, wrapped in a heavy blanket. You see, the old man, he hadn't stood a chance. Bring us back, Dep, said Mercury. And that's what I did. Thank you. Let's see what else to say. All right, so this is my first book. It came out in 2019. And it took like 40 years to write this book. Like I'm 46 now, it took like my whole life to write this book, right? But the thing about that they don't tell you is that it doesn't matter how hard it is to write your first book, there's nothing quite like it. It's nothing like going into a bookstore and like seeing your book on a shelf, like walking around town, like you minding your business on the bus and somebody's like got your book in their hand, like reading your book, you know, they don't know that you're the author of the book, that kind of thing. And so that being said, like you write your first book, it's like your first book is for yourself. This book is like my teenage dream. Like if I was going to write a book, it's like a 17-year-old, this is that book. This book is set in New Orleans, 50 years in the future. It's a dystopian like satire book about like how crazy race is in the South. It's like real dark and really strange. And when I look at it now, I'm kind of like, huh, that's a pretty good line. You're a pretty good writer, right? But then I was like, you know what? This book is like for me, right? The short story collection, which we're also selling here, this book is for my hometown. There are 19 short stories in this book. And I had a very simple mission. As somebody who loves art, who loves writing, who loves reading, I love it all. I mean, you can name a writer, Virginia Woolf, Shakespeare, Toni Morrison, Ernest Gaines. I love all these people, right? But one thing I noticed about New Orleans that was very strange to me was if I asked people who are the New Orleans writers, this is who they'd name. Like you say, classic writers. They would name Tennessee Williams. We have a festival in the city that happens every single year. It's a wonderful festival, kind of like this. It's really big. It's a lot of fun. We have a Faulkner Festival. He's another important New Orleans type writer. There's Sherwood Anderson, who's like from 100 years ago. He's one of the first big short story collection writers of all time. Truman Capote, In Cold Blood. I go on and on and on and on. I had read these works. I had seen the plays. I loved the work. But I'm like, wait a minute, I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. This is a majority Black city. Where my brothers and sisters at? And then they say, well, contemporary writers. We have Jessamine Ward. She teaches at Tulane right now. I know her. It's my big sister. She's a genius. She won the National Book Award twice. She is from DeLisle, Mississippi. She claims Mississippi is her hometown, right? And so I'm starting to write this book, this short story collection of 19 short stories. I'm like, you know what? This got to be the most New Orleans book ever written. Because I'm from New Orleans. I was born in the city. I was raised in the city. I still live there. And so this is 19 short stories, mostly set like in the present time period. Pretty much all African-American lead characters, although it's funny, the guy I just read just now, he's like the one white main character in the entire collection. He's like the, the deputy who works for the, who works at the prison. When you write a book, there's always something that's very personal about it. And what I realize is that a lot of these stories are about people in my life, my cousins, my aunties, my grandparents, people I used to work with. But sometimes the stories are even more personal than that. Something I figured out is that there are two kind of people in the world. There are people that have mommy issues, and people that have daddy issues. And then there's the rest of us who have both of those issues. So I'm reading this is like one of my daddy issues pieces right here. Give me a second. See what to play with this. We got any poets in the house? Where the poets at? Poets, raise your hands, poets, please. All right. So I'm not a poet, but I've started writing poetry in the past couple of years. And sometimes you start feeling yourself. And so when I was getting ready to publish this book, I told my editor, what if I put a poem in this book? Like, what if I put like a poem inside this short story collection? She's like, all right, bet. So my collection my short story collection has a poem in it. It's called Spinning. Let's see. What page is it on? So on page 97. All right. So try something different for this one. Hey, Kay, can you hear me?
I refused my father just once. He asked me to take him a pack of cigarettes. Grant one was in the car, alone in the night, already smart about football. But third is life among friends. The same person fell along the body. Shooting that we got the body, I say, Paul, I do. Love you. Breathe. Mama Christ was years after death. His meeting ends about surgery. Don't you miss it, son? The green waves of sunset, wings from the left. After I feel my cars, yes, and you do right from me to them. Every cell of my body is moving with heavy water. In my daydreams, she inhales. Smoke levels alone and cause treatment. 1982, I'm 4 years old. Dad takes a little peanut butter ball and work for opposition, reaches over the keys for taxis, rolls to the transmission to drive, lights all down the ice, black rock road, or better, highway, blocking my back. At the big path of wind flowing through the path. Mr. Turner at your car, turns to bed, spins up in that truck at intersection. 2 inmates on the back converting the 15-year-old baby in the little day time. He reaching over the kingly in place. As I think, this will always be.
Yeah, I said mommy and daddy issues. Actually, that's like my whole family issues. Mama, daddy, grandma, grandpa, they all up in there. But I didn't even, it's funny about like when you write something, how you realize that your subconscious knows more about your life than you know about your own life. And so I wrote that poem, and one of the little themes in that poem is like cigarettes and how they poison people. You know, I'm not a smoker myself, but I realized that like cigarettes like killed my grandmother, killed my dad, gave my mama breast cancer. That's my subconscious doing that. So writing can actually show you things about your own life you don't even know, yourself, right? Let's see what to try next. I don't know. So many possibilities. Yeah, let's try this. Hell, feeling good as hell. I love Lizzo. Even though she can have some issues later, I still love her. I still love her. That's my girl. That's my girl. All right. So that's a feel-good song, right? But as a writer, like sometimes some of the things you write are not necessarily feel-good things, but they're helpful things. People never talk about the fact that when you actually write something that's very personal, it can actually heal part of what you're dealing with in your own life. I mean, there's other ways of doing it. There's therapy, there's going to church, talking to your parents, there's that kind of stuff. But like just a good story can like make you kind of just put it on the page and kind of go, I feel a lot better now. And so I mentioned that, well, I didn't actually say all this. So I've had a very adventurous life. I just turned 46 years old. I am putting my 3rd book out in February. I'm getting the Louisiana Writers Award next Saturday. I'm here with you all right now. But before all this stuff happened, I was a restaurateur. My wife and I owned a restaurant in New Orleans called Pelican Bay. She's also a lawyer, and she used to do criminal law. Now she does all kind of law. Pelican Bay was a joke name because if you ever seen a movie with Denzel Washington and Snoop Dogg in it called Training Day from back in the day. So Denzel he's like this big, like mob type dude, right? And at the end of it, he's like being really mad. He's like, I'm gonna put all you up in Pelican Bay with no shoelaces. So criminal lawyers call a restaurant Pelican Bay. So there's that. I practiced law for 16 years. I was working in New Orleans. I've traveled the whole country. But now I'm a writer. When I look back at it, I think those are some hard years. Like I worked 7-hour days, 9-hour days, 10-hour days. We had a trial going on. I'll be in the office like 1 o'clock at night, getting ready for the next morning to go to trial, that kind of stuff. I learned a lot. I don't miss it. So this story is like me reflecting on that experience, but not like the work part of it, like the emotional part of it. Like, how do you feel to be with the people that you're working with? This is a lesson in life for like the 5-year-olds in the audience. The people around you are the ones that make your life sort of worth living. If it's the wrong people, it gets real hard real fast. So let's read this one. This is a story in the collection called Token. And oftentimes I'll write a very short story and it leads to a bigger story, but sometimes the reverse happens. This is a novel about a lawyer that created a 3-page story about a lawyer. Token. But I almost forgot. I got to give my props. There's a writer named Lady Page is a great son called her. She is a story that is called her. Girls will most say, "I'll try to figure it out." She's like, "I'll check that word." Her book is about the women who made this different person about this problem. Very problem is called be quiet, be slow, right? They put her feet. You might know it's a big problem that there's a kind of amount of positions that are dedicated to this. To give an example, there's a man like he takes the way from how right? He was a person who young form in the hour from the day of probably not to be here, not to get it. Sometimes not really experience so get to the office by 6 a.m. Then before 6 a.m. Where student time, you don't find it. While the both sides already not. So they can do training. We only have spoken. But we serve the last thing would be quiet. They feel quiet. We serve to only speak of spirit. Your food, your time. He votes
be walnuts, be milk chocolate, let them consume and wipe their mouths with green. But don't show it to me, the black folks who work around the building. Those security guards, they press like the the bag hands where you're making this thing, the air force, no, they're lost, they're able to fly because one of them is God. What do you do? Yeah. Yeah. Talk about better minds. Or protest. When you look in the mirror, they're not moving mountains. You want to stop? Stop. This is how you find this is the game that you try to stop. This is how you use that. Yes. But always the door closes. If they see you buy a hamburger and show fries to your pink mouth, they have vision, savage, no. They agree. Never eat fried chicken. One word. It feels good when you smile. This is how you smile the dog on his soul. How you smile. Send the guy who said, take a vacation now, take a vacation for everything. Always go to the bathroom, when you do that, close the door. Never be helpful with God for that next year. See, they don't know what they're asking. But they don't want to that they made it for a table. And you two were wondering if they did. Each person was you heard it. Something wrong. But the name is not time. But if you don't say wrong, don't even think. Don't be better. You really not understand. Come with the cheer, with the conversation, and tell all the people listening how great it was working to be on their team. This is how you appear to be twice the man that you are. This is how you make an image of that suit. This is how you take a book and develop all the parts third. This is how you say that. And all. Our little bird told me that some of y'all from school had something. They don't like, wait a minute. So that's not long. I'm going to hear today. I don't want to participate. But they participated was created out of a young man who is senior for the first time to be qualified. He probably did it. And looking up the price, he can find his need. And so when they do it, they come song, like mom, little baby girl, that kind of shit. So we go out on the side. And in that story, they from New Orleans, like on the job, you know, like oh, that's the problem. You're a fella, a victim, that kind of thing. But that story is exactly what I'm having to do. Slow things, feel like those things, this good story pop, and how it is, it's a great story. So that's what about all of this is one around the fun of the job. And it's based on a super old movie called I movie from 1947. It's exactly the plot. There's a father, there's son, it is after World War II, trying to find a job, like, just work out. And so, I say this is when I put my problem down, it's not something that is wrong. You know, like what Thomas said, that thing is terror, they and like you know, that's hard leadership is amazing. He's like millions all of and it made it from I'm gonna read more pieces than pass off to the some Winslow type so my people
Let's see, what else should I read? Let the music choose. I went to a shelter for women and children in New Orleans on Monday, and one of the ladies that requested this story, and I was shocked. I'm like, you really want to hear that story right now? So I'll try it. Give me a second. It's called Election. It's on page 111. So y'all may not know this, but we had an election in New Orleans or in Louisiana last week. We have a new governor. I'm not here to talk politics, but I'll talk politics. It is a terrible decision that the state has made. He is anti-everything, anti-women, children, queer people, Black folks, you name it. I might get fired for saying that. Hey, if I get fired, it ain't worth having the job. But anyway, so this story is about a politician who maybe he's a good guy, maybe he's not a good guy. It's a complicated question. The narrator, you'll find out very quickly, is a young woman, maybe 20 years old, give or take, who works for the campaign. So let me go ahead and read this one. Election. I read the script verbatim, always starting with the line. My name is Simone, and I'm calling you the boldest crew cares about our community. I say 20, call on God, bringing in my hands, rolling more prison daily to the wages. One of the things you can be lost is a base of flowers. Flowers not specific, and then flowers take right next. This is the other thing. You make people. I go to the dates, wondering why would I stand in this new line of the night? My arms shouldn't be my side. His feet alone in my nose. Each morning I really talk. He would upon me up. So that's what So I have no idea we're on time right now. Am I like an hour in? And am I like, we're wrapping it up? All right. So last thing I'll say is this. So I told you about my first book, which is for sale out there. My second book for sale out there. This is my third book, comes out in February. This is called The American Daughters. A friend said call it The Confederate Daughters. I almost did that, but I didn't want to cause too much stir. But this book is close to my heart. I've read many books and I've seen many films about quote unquote slavery times. And it's kind of the same story over and over again. And there's like some dark things and it's like yada, yada, yada. But I'm from New Orleans, and New Orleans is not like most places. So even though New Orleans had slavery in the city, First of all, we were a city, not a rural area. And secondly, New Orleans was majority Black even back then. It was actually 2/3 Black in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. And this is what people don't know about New Orleans also. Half of the Black people in New Orleans during slavery times were free. They had their own schools, they owned their own companies. Some of them was super duper rich. I mean, they had like their own ships and stuff like that. So I'm like, well, what do you like tell us from that point of view? So in this book, which is about quote unquote the slavery times in New Orleans, the main character, Addie, is a girl that comes to New Orleans with her mother, and they figure out that New Orleans has a Black women and girls spy ring. And that spy ring is killing off the Confederates one by one. And so, of course, she joins the Confederate, or the anti-Confederates, right? That's the story of this book right here. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of funny and weird. And the picture right there, the little part there in the corner, it says "For Our Mothers," I think the catchphrase. And that tray that she's carrying with the little glasses on it is full of poison for her master. And she's bringing it to him on the very first page. So there's that. So any questions about anything, anything I've read about the writing craft, about the world at large, you know, how to get rich quick, anything like that? Questions? What y'all want to know? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. So you made them rewrite Girl by Mickey Kincaid. That's brilliant. Wow. If y'all don't know, this is our Eudora Welty scholar who won the big prize. Fantastic, fantastic. Thanks for telling me about that. I love that story so much. It's like, it's kind of a story, it's kind of a poem. And it's like, so in your, no, it's one long sentence. Like you can't see it like I did in my book is one long sentence, just like she did it. You know, she made a whole new form up pretty much. It's a brilliant story, brilliant. Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. Other questions out there? Yes. Yeah, what's your name? Ava Grace. Thank you. Oh, wonderful question, Ava Grace. The question is, how did I decide to stop like doing the law thing and switch over to the writing thing? It was really simple. I was in a lot of pain. You know, like, I mean, look, if you run track and like pull your quad or something like that, you know that you're in pain, right? But sometimes if you're in psychological pain, you don't want to admit it. Like you're tough, you have things to cope with it. But I was like, man, like I'm not sleeping very good. You know, like I'm kind of nervous all the time. I don't feel that great. I don't want to smile that much. You know, even like my hobbies, like playing video games, I didn't want to do that anymore. Something got to change. And so long story short, I'm like, well, okay, clearly this is the wrong use of my talents. If you could imagine, there's an idea in real estate, like the best use for a building. You wouldn't put an ice cream stand in a stadium. You wouldn't turn a veterinarian shop into like a child care center. My best use was not being a lawyer. I was a pretty good lawyer. I made a lot of money doing it, and it was a lot of fun sometimes. But with this, it just feels more natural. You know, if I got up at 7 o'clock in the morning to work as a lawyer and work till almost midnight, I felt exhausted. If I write for 12 hours, I feel energized. And frankly, the universe tells you if you're in the right place. It really does. You know, as a lawyer, I was like, you know, struggling to get from place to place, doing things and being like, man, why is this flight taking so long? And I wasn't even saying that I'm like getting this prize next week because I'm trying to brag. I'm trying to say that I'm not even like using like my full power right now. I've written these 3 books in the past 4 years. You know, this one had 9 nominations for prizes, mostly out of New York. This one is the One Book, One New Orleans pick for this year. This book's coming out, it's getting like, you know, I'm not trying and things are happening good. So what I'm saying is when you look at what you're doing, see how people respond to you, see how the universe responds to you. And if you're getting good responses, you're probably doing the right thing, you know? So great question, Ava Grace. I love that so much. Any other questions? Maybe 1 or 2 more before I shuffle off into the darkness. Over here and then over there. What's your name? Hey, good to see you again, Megan. You bought my book. I saw that. You had my book. All right, great. Ooh, Megan, that's the question. Are we all family, right? We all safe in this little space together. I can trust all y'all, right? Look, it's real simple. It's super simple. the choices made by our leaders, but also by people who are just everyday citizens have been choices that are anti-education, anti the arts, and anti-supporting creativity. So the fact of the matter is Louisiana is one of the most underfunded states in the country just for like high school, middle school, and college. That's one example. Compared to maybe Massachusetts, Connecticut, where they spend like 5 times as much, but some ridiculous amount of money, right? When I was a child, the reason why I played music, like a lot of orchestral music, I grew up playing orchestra. I played a string bass as a kid, right? And so I actually came to Hattiesburg as like a 10-year-old, like to play my bass, like as part of the orchestra, right? Within about 3 years of me doing that, the state of Louisiana, they canceled the money for the program. So I don't ever see kids in my state playing like violins and violas and stuff anymore. It's just gone now. That's a real effect. And so then on top of that, there's the draw of places like New York, which is like a vacuum cleaner for talent. It's like, well, look, you can't write in your hometown, come to New York. And I have friends that have done that and been very successful. My wonderful sister, Sarah Broom, my brother Cassie was up there for a minute. So many writers I love and respect. And frankly, I was like, you know what? I can't keep struggling in this state, in this city like this. I got to get out of here. And I was trying to leave. And this is like a really old reference for people who are young, but for people with gray hair, what I'm talking about. There's an old movie called It's a Wonderful Life about a nice young man that tries to leave his hometown, like to make a life in New York City, and he can't escape his hometown. I was trying to get out of Louisiana forever. And Hurricane Katrina happened, and the recession happened. And the lesson that I learned was that, Maurice, you couldn't leave because you had stories to learn and to tell in your own state. So I get mad that people are not supporting us more. And that, with this new governor, I mean, look, I don't know what his whole plan is, but I've seen he's like attacked a professor I know at LSU. I'm like, what is this dude's plan? Like, what are you trying to make us do? Like, do you look around and see people suffering? Like, there's no health care. Does it make you happy to see that? Like, is that making you feel like you're doing a good job or what? So it's been choices. And hopefully things will change. If I can teleport into the future, maybe it's like a state full of people who have good health care, good education, they're writing amazing books. For my part, I'm trying to get people in my state, especially people in high school and younger, to write their own stories because they can do it. I mean, people who are younger are great, energetic storytellers, and they're better than I am. I've heard some young people's stories. I want to hear more of those stories. So thank you. Megan, last question, please. Yes, what's your name? Hey, Claire. Ooh, y'all got like the biggest, I need like 3 hours to answer these questions. All right, I'll try. So Claire asked, how do you as a young person resist the pressure to make money and to be an important person when art is calling you? Whether you are a writer or a singer or a poet or a fashion designer or architect, what do you do? How do you deal with that? Look, we live in a society. We live in a capitalist society, which basically tells you that everything is about money first and foremost. That's the reason why, and look, this might be like, I'm not even gonna like try and badmouth the previous president, but a society that says you can be the kindest person in your state and run for president, and they'll be like, no, that person, they're not president. But if you're a billionaire who was on television, we don't care if you have any experience, we're gonna make you the president. All right, fine, right? I was in Senegal for a month in August. I went to Africa, to the motherland. I was there writing and meeting people, having great experiences, and to see how they live their lives in comparison. I mean, every single thing about their lives was different. People wouldn't try and get rich. They're trying to make a living, support their families, but others like spend time with your parents, with your children, have a community. So to not be too discursive, I'll say this. You can go after making all the money and wind up like Elon Musk, right? Or like Mr. Trump, or like Jeff Bezos. I can go on and on and on and on. Do those guys seem happy to you? Not a single one of them. Or you can create beautiful things and be like some of these ancient Greek poets, like Sappho, right? She was a lesbian girl in the year 570, looking at somebody she had a crush on and being like, girl, I like you. Leave that boy. You don't want that boy. Leave that boy, And we're reading that 2,700 years later because it was that good of a poem, right? Same for Virgil, Ovid, Achilles. I go on and on and on. That work lasts forever because it was beautiful. It was meant to show us ourselves. That's what art is, a mirror. Art shows the community. And so I know it's hard. Take your time. Don't hurt yourself. Make a game plan for yourself. Understand that life is very long. You can make a lot of mistakes. And you can recover from those mistakes too. Look, I was a 16-year lawyer and I was stuck, and I found a way out of that. And now I've traveled to Amsterdam, Berlin, all around the world, Africa, and it feels so much better. And so I don't have any specific answers, but I will say that as long as you're doing what you love, that's a lot. That's its own kind of wealth. And so on that note, I'm about to jet, all right? Y'all take care.
Thank you. All right, we will take a brief 10-minute break right now. So I will see you back here after that for our final two authors of this morning's session. Thank you. All right, if you would please come back in and take your seats, we will start very shortly with the second half of this morning's session. How are you doing? While we wait for others to come and join us, are you having a good time? Yeah, enjoying yourselves? Excellent. We're fortunate to have so many of you here with us this morning, not only students from MSMS, but also from Rosedale. I think both of them joining quite frequently. I think I've seen them every time I've been to the Welty Symposium. So welcome to all of you, students and adults and writers and non-writers alike. I also hope you found the restrooms. There's only this one pair over here, so. All right, well, I will go ahead and begin the second half of this morning's session. Welcome back. We have two more writers to feature this morning, and the first of these last two writers in this morning's block is Deshaun Charles Winslow. Deshaun Charles Winslow is a Center for Fiction First Novel Prize winner for his book In West Mills, as well as an American Book Award recipient, a Willie Morris Award for Southern Fiction winner, and a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book, Lambda Literary and Publishing Triangle Awards. Though he now calls Atlanta home, he was born and raised in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and graduated from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Concerning his latest book, Decent People, which he is here to share with us, Robert Jones Jr., National Book Award finalist and New York Times best-selling author of The Prophets, writes, "One of Winslow's greatest gifts is his world-building mastery. His rendering of the Southern landscape is extraordinary. It's been a very long time since I've read a good old-fashioned whodunit, and this is a most outstanding one." With that in mind, let's welcome to the stage Deshaun Charles Winslow.
Good morning. It's still morning. First, I'd like to thank the university and the symposium for inviting me here. It's my first time, and I'm really enjoying it, and I hope to come back. So thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about and read a little bit from this novel, Decent People. And so I'm going to start off by telling you how the idea for this book came. In 2018, I don't remember if it was Thanksgiving or Christmas, but I went home for the holidays, for one of those holidays. And my mom and her sisters were talking, and my mother is the second born of 9 children. And so there were 5, and then my grandparents separated, but then continued to have children, but there was a big gap. And so my younger aunts are they're much younger than my mom and the other set of kids. And so one of my younger aunts brought up this drowning that happened in 1975 or 76. And she was beginning to tell the story. And my mom stopped her and said, "No, you have it all wrong. I was 18, you were only 8. I remember what happened." And so these 3 ladies on a Sunday morning, these 3 elderly ladies, they carpooled to church. And one of them lived on the bank of the canal. It's a canal that runs through this town called South Mills, North Carolina. And when the 3 of them were backing out of this lady's driveway, something went wrong. No one will ever know what the malfunction was, but the car went into the canal and they drowned. And so when I heard this story, I had never heard it before. My mom and her siblings were always talking about things that happened when they were growing up. And I had never heard this story of these 3 ladies drowning on a canal that I drove across and past all the time, and it was, morbidly fascinating, So I decided to try to think of a story. So, try to put that in a story. And I pitched this idea to my editor at the time, and she absolutely loved it, and it, Decent People turned out to be a mystery, but that wasn't the original intent. The novel was going to be about these 3 people who had drowned and how people who were close to them, whether enemies or loved ones, how they reacted to this, this drowning. But when I started to write the book, COVID had hit, and I was, I just couldn't concentrate, but I had a deadline because I had accepted money for a book. And and I did not want to have to return the money. And so I was struggling to be interested. I hadn't lost interest in this, this accidental drowning in this small town, and people didn't drown in this area, and especially not elderly people in cars. But for me, there was no like question. There was no question to answer. And I was watching a lot of TV, in the early years of the pandemic. And I found myself watching a lot of stuff that I had grown up watching, like Murder, She Wrote and Matlock, Father Dowling mysteries, the sort of things my mom and I watched on weeknights. And I thought, maybe I should change this to a murder mystery to get me interested again, and to create a question for readers to have. And and of course, my first book doesn't have a plot, so it's not always about who did it and when will X happen and that sort of thing. But in this particular case, I said I have to create a way to get this book done, and it has to be. I wanted it to be interesting for me so that it is interesting for readers. So I decided that these three people who drowned would not drown, and that they would be murdered, and that they wouldn't be three like old ladies going to church. They would be three siblings, two sisters and a brother, and I made them unlikable to most people, So I just changed who those people were. I changed how they died. And that really put some fire under me, and it got me really interested. And so that's how the book got completed. But I had never written a murder mystery. I had probably only read one murder mystery cover to cover, and watched a lot of TV, which is it's like 50-minute, not even, because with commercials, it's really like a 40-minute show, And so I thought, how am I going to write a 300-page novel when I don't know anything about mystery? And so what I did is I went online and I Googled what are the elements of mystery, And so it gave me, it gives you the list. Anyone can go and look this up, and you can find it for romance, for fantasy, whatever. And I saw, you need red herrings, you need for your sleuth to have a problem, you need, all these elements, right? And I thought, okay, I don't want to write a very, very traditional mystery. I want there to be a murder, and I want the reader to care who killed people. But I'm a character-driven writer. I'm about people and relationships and that sort of thing. So I decided that what I would do is that I would play with those elements and just use tidbits of them. So I thought of my red herrings, but what I decided to do is to make it very clear to the reader right away that the people who are red herrings aren't the killer, And so when I created these characters who would have a reason to kill those victims, immediately we know that they are not the real killer. So that, that was the play on the elements. So anyway, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read for you a little bit from three different characters. One of them, I'll tell you a little bit about each person before I read from the first couple of pages from their section. The first is Eunice. Well, first, let me tell you a little bit about the three victims. Their names are Marva, Marion, and Lazarus. They're two sisters and a brother. They are older people. They are, they're 60, 58, and 55, I think, or maybe a little younger. And Marion is a doctor. She's the town's only Black doctor, but they have recently returned to North Carolina from New Jersey. They haven't lived in the South in a very long time. They are very different people. And they, quite frankly, they are stuck up. They think they are better than everyone in town. And the only reason why they have moved back is because Jersey, it was a time there was a lot of riots. And the doctor decided that she wanted to come back down south and make as much money as she could from, in her hometown. And they have property there, the property that they they grew up on. But the doctor is not a nice person. She is not a nice person at all. Okay. And her sister Marva she's the one that has a little bit of spice in her life, but she's heavily oppressed. If I had to explain their relationship, imagine that you have two siblings. Imagine that you have an older sibling who all of your life, your parents have been telling you, you're not as good as your sister. You're not as good as your brother. They're the one with the brains. They're the one that's going to take care of you, So Marva and Lazarus, they have grown up hearing this. So that's sort of the family dynamics of the three victims. They're not, they're not evil people, all three of them, but one of them kind of is, okay? And so the other two sort of get lumped in with that. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the first red herring. Red herring number one, her name is Eunice. Eunice is a grocery store owner. She's married to a man who cheats on her a lot. And she has a son, the two of them have a son, and he is queer. He's 14 years old. He's not open, but he is, I guess you could say he's obviously queer. And so I'll read now so you'll be able to figure out what the issue is. Eunice Manning loved her son Leroy more than anything or anyone in the world. Leroy was her heartbeat, and he had been that for her for the second the nurse placed him in her arms 14 years ago, moments after she had delivered him. I'm sorry, nerves, give me a second. Eunice could have had almost any type of life she wanted. She was a great singer, and she was known around West Mills as one of the pretty girls. Once, during a visit to New York City for a choir competition, a couple of years before Leroy was born, a woman sitting in a black limousine rolled down her window and said to Eunice, "You are absolutely breathtaking, dear. Daniele Luna could be your twin sister." "I don't know who that is, ma'am," Eunice had replied, smiling. "She's one of the most beautiful models alive I've ever worked with," the woman said before rolling her window back up. But Eunice didn't care. Being a great mother, someone Leroy would always be proud of, was her top priority. He would want for nothing. Her adoptive parents, the Mannings, had done that for her. She would do the same for him. Eunice and her husband Breezy had different expectations of their son's future. Breezy simply wanted the boy to someday finish high school and be employable. Eunice fantasized about him being the next Rod Carew or Walt Bellamy. If all went well, Leroy would retire from the courts or fields young enough to help her run her businesses. By then, she would have several grocery stores all over the state, she imagined, not just the one in West Mills or the second location in Currituck. Then when it became clear after the 5th grade that he had no interest in sports but excelled in school, she envisioned him as a lawyer, a doctor, a professor even. If anyone asked, Eunice would tell them that everything she did was so that her son would have a head start in the world that could be so cruel to Black men. Even her misguided attempts to shelter Leroy were all made with the best of intentions. So it caused her insufferable pain to know that he was hurting and that it was her fault. 2 weeks ago, Eunice had taken Leroy to Dr. Marion Harmon to have the gay removed. Hypnosis would be the method, Eunice assumed. She hadn't bothered to ask. That was the second mistake. The first was thinking her son needed fixing. And after a couple of hours after she had dropped him off at the Harmon's house for the treatment, on that Saturday morning at 11:30, Eunice would learn that violence was the intended method. But Leroy had gotten away. Thank you, Jesus. Savannah Russett's son had helped him. With Leroy knowing that Eunice had sought someone's help and without Breezy's knowledge, he would have never agreed to it. The boy had every right to expose her for it. He was liable to tell Breezy. He might tell the Lovings. He might tell the Mannings. In a fit of sadness or anger, Leroy might tell anyone who would listen. And Eunice could lose all respectability for taking such a matter to someone outside of the family. It was one thing for people to think something about your child. To confirm it was another thing entirely. So that's Eunice. She's one of, the fake red herrings. And Eunice is a character from my first novel, In West Mills. So if you decide to read them as companions, you get a glimpse into her childhood and why her son being gay is such a awful thing. But that was the times, right? Everybody thought it was an awful thing, sadly. So the next character is Savannah. And so it's important to know that Savannah is a white lady, whereas Eunice is a Black woman. And Savannah is a white lady who, as a teenager or right after she graduated high school, she married a Black man and they eloped and moved to New York. And he suddenly dies in his 30s of a heart condition. And due to financial restraints, she sort of has no choice but to move back to West Mills to live in his ancestral home with her two sons. But that also means that she has to live in a black neighborhood. And Savannah is from the east side of town, which is the white side. And she is from a very wealthy family. Her father and grandparents are some of the richest people in this county. And so she became very good friends with one of the victims, the doctor's sister. And so here's the beginning of her section. Savannah Temple Russett's two sons were all she had, and she would do anything to protect them. But she had let down her guard and trusted someone else briefly with their care. She could only hope Terrence and Troy would someday forget how poorly Marion Harmon had treated them. She sought to use them to inflict harm. And Savannah would never tell the boys that Marva Harmon, the person she believed to be her very best friend in the world, and Terrence and Troy thought of as an aunt, had been unwilling to stand up for them. Savannah didn't blame Eunice Loving one bit for confronting Marion, whether privately or at a place of business, for bullying Leroy. Savannah, too, had cause for anger towards the Harmon sisters. But my God, woman, did you kill them? Savannah looked at the clock on the nightstand. The Harmon's memorial service was set to begin in an hour, and she was still sitting on her bed, back against the headboard, crying and trying to smoke a cigarette without dropping ashes and burning her sheets. If Terrence and Troy had not brought in a toasted waffle and a half a glass of orange juice, she might not have had the strength to sit upright. Next to the clock sat an old empty Tylenol bottle where Savannah used to hide her Valium. She felt as though the mildest of withdrawal symptoms would kill her. But this wasn't new to her. She had gone through this years before, just before moving back to West Mills from New York. Savannah hadn't had a pill in almost a week, having run out of them the day after the Harmons were found dead. A damn crime, she had thought when she realized she'd taken the last one. She knew she would need at least one to get through the memorial service. And one would certainly come in handy in a couple days when she would go to the county clerk's office to ask for another extension on the property tax bill. The house where she, Terrence, and Troy lived, the same house they had moved into after returning to West Mills, was a godsend. Mortgage-free, but oh, the taxes. Sometimes Savannah wondered if she would be better off renting. Savannah couldn't bring herself to look at the notice again. It too occupied space on her nightstand. It was printed on yellow paper as if it brought joyful news of some sort. If the payment wasn't made within 10 days, the marshal would be there to install padlocks. Then where would they go? Not across the canal to the east side, where her father and grandmother would say, "We told you not to marry him." But none of that mattered today. She had a service to attend. With what feelings exactly, Savannah couldn't say. It was a strange notion, paying respect to someone who had been your best friend and then your enemy. Even so, one thing remained undeniable. Savannah missed her badly. "Come on, Savannah," she whispered to herself, looking across the room into the mirror. She had to sweep her long blonde hair to the back of her head to see her own face. Get up, get moving. The boys didn't want to go with her to the memorial service. She didn't blame them, but she was still shaken by the murders, and there was no way she was leaving them home alone, not with a killer on the loose. Whether it was Limp Seymour, Eunice, or someone else, Savannah couldn't be sure. Regardless, the boys would have to be mad at her. She would make them join her at the church. And this final section is for a man named Ted Temple. So Ted is Savannah's father, and they are estranged again because she married a Black man. And for people who won't read the book, I won't share how he's related to the victims or how he's connected to them. But what I'll say about Ted is that, well, I'll say a question that I often get whenever I do a reading or talk about the book. People ask me, why do you humanize Ted so much? He's a racist. He's a racist old white man who shunned his daughter for marrying a Black man. He doesn't even acknowledge his grandchildren and all that sort of thing. And I think the reason why I humanize any of my characters, whether they are good or bad, is because I don't believe that anyone is all bad, and I don't believe anyone is all good, frankly. But in particular with Ted, when I was growing up, there was this old man named Mr. Logan. He lived, about a quarter of a mile walk from where I lived, and he owned a small store that was in his front yard. And this store was very, very, very small. It maybe was this section of seats, it might have been that big, and it had one gas pump out front. And Mr. Logan, I was probably 10, 11, 12 when I was allowed to walk to his store without a parent. And he was probably 88, 89. And he didn't sit in the store all day. He only walked from his house to the store when someone came, and he was very old. So you had to either yell his name, which we often did, my friends and I, we would yell, "Mr. Logan, Mr. Logan." And if he didn't come out in like 10 minutes, we would go and knock on his door. And then he would finally come out. But Mr. Logan was, to my memory, a very, very nice man. He was very curious about us, my friends and I. And when I say my friends and I, this was a group of Black kids, and he was very nice. He asked us questions. How are you doing in school? Who's your teacher this year? He remembered our parents. Does your mom still work at the plant over there? Does your dad still work at the shipyard? And finally, when I got a little older, my mother said to me, she said, not that it mattered because Mr. Logan wasn't even ordering new products for the store anyway, but she said, "Stop giving my money to Mr. Logan." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "He's a Klansman." And I was like, "No, he's not. Mr. Logan is not a Klansman." And she said, "Yes, he is. He's a Klansman." And I remember saying, "I've been going to Mr. Logan's and buying candy and soda for the past 5 years. Why are you telling me this now?" And she explained that all the other kids were going to Logan's to buy candy and sodas, and she didn't want me to be the kid that couldn't go to Logan's, you know. And after all, he was 100 years old. What was he gonna do? You know. But I remember her telling me, you know, that he was a Klansman and that he had been involved in some beatings in, you know, in previous decades and that sort of thing. And it was really hard for me to reconcile that this man had been involved in, you know, in those things. And so when I was writing this book, Mr. Logan, you know, he came into my mind, and I thought, you know, and I will agree with people who've politely reprimanded me for giving Ted so much humanity, that Ted probably, and therefore Mr. Logan probably would not have given me that much humanity. You know, I definitely agree with that argument. But I couldn't help but wonder what made this man in his 80s, who goes from being a Klansman to who seemingly at least genuinely caring about the Black people in his community? Was it guilt? You know, was he a Klansman because his father and his uncles were Klansmen and that was what was expected of him? You know, like, who was the real Mr. Logan is the question that came to my mind. And so anyway, when I wrote about Ted, I think I was writing about Mr. Logan, you know, and Mr. Logan had a daughter. He may have had several children, but I know for a fact that he had one daughter. And I just thought, what would Mr. Logan do if his daughter came home at 18 and said, I'm in love with a Black man and I'm marrying him tomorrow, you know? So anyway, this section is Ted. Theodore Ted Temple sat in the small office of his shopping center, thinking about the large wire transfer that would arrive in his bank within the next month. It was his best attempt at keeping his mind off Dr. Marion Harmon. Ted had been in his office the day the Harmons had been found dead. He had heard it over the CB radio, which sat on the corner of his desk next to the telephone, next to a snow globe he had bought when he and Marion ran off together for a weekend in Pennsylvania. So that's how they're involved. Okay. He'd gotten one for Marion too, but she dropped hers accidentally while unpacking it at home. Now his snow globe sat on the ledge of his office's only window, sunlight bouncing off of it. It was a good thing that he was alone when he'd heard the news of Marion's death. Had anyone seen him gasp, slide from his chair onto the floor, cry, hold his chest, and rip his shirt pocket in pursuit of a nitroglycerin tablet, they would have figured out that Dr. Harmon had been much more to Ted than a monthly paycheck for renting a commercial unit. He had loved Marion more than he loved any woman in the world, but she had turned on him, and his mourning had its limits. With the forthcoming deposit would come the self-respect Ted had been waiting on for a long time. It might even bring him more respect from the people on the east side of West Mills, where he'd lived most of his life. If anyone bothered to ask him, he would tell them that it was respect he wanted most of all, the kind that came from decisions he made, not some handed down respect. Ted was finally selling the shopping center and the land on which it sat. He had always believed that someday it would be worth much more than his older brother had paid for it. May God rest Chip's soul. From the moment Ted inherited the commercial property in 70 and the other scattered properties around town, he wanted to ditch them. But then West Mills' population had started to grow. More and more Coast Guard families were moving to the area. It was only a matter of time before some developer wanted to use the space for a larger shopping mall or a gated community full of identical houses. Ted decided to hold out, wait a while. Having little else to do, Ted watched the shopping center run itself, and he bided his time. Now his patience was about to pay off, so long as Jeff Darby, the man who'd made the offer on the property, didn't find any reason to pull out of the deal. Darby had already ordered more appraisals and assessments than anyone could imagine. He had permits to build a three-level indoor shopping mall, and he had investors galore. Ted imagined it would likely be an eyesore, but people would love it anyway. But Darby was old-fashioned, one of those good old boys, a third-generation Klansman, though people use that term less and less. If Darby got so much as a hair-thin notion that Ted had been having an affair with Marion or any other woman who wasn't white, the deal would be off, no questions about it. Darby loved money, but he respected tradition far more. Marion had known that about him, and she had threatened to use it. And to combat Marion's threat, Ted had felt it necessary to come up with a plan. He would make his own threat that would, no doubt, send her packing back to the north. As much as the impulse made him cringe, he would have seen it through. Marion had left him no choice, but she, Marva, and Lazarus were killed before he had a chance. And though it disgusted him to think of it, he was glad he hadn't had to cause her any harm. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Yes, Megan. Yeah, right. So first, a note on the title is that I didn't come up with the title. In the book, I used the phrase decent people, I think maybe 3 times, and so that's what my editor was like, you should call it decent people. The original title was Pharaoh's Army. And even when I came up with that title, I was kind of wishy-washy about it. The reason why I thought of that title initially is because the Harmons, the 3 murder victims, their father was a very imposing, mean figure. And I was going to name him Pharaoh. And so they were his army. Yeah. But yeah, my editor said, at least 5 people say decent people in the novel. So let's call it decent. Let's call it decent people. And I was like, duh, But to your question about what's my definition of decent people, I think, as I said earlier, I don't think that anyone is all good or anyone is all evil. That's my personal belief. But I think a decent person sort of knows when they've gone too far on the wrong side, and says, okay, even if I'm doing this bad thing, one thing I'll say is that a lot of people in this book do bad things, but they believe they are doing them for a good reason, and I think for me, I think a decent person says, yeah, I know that this bad thing I'm going to do is going to be good for some, but it's not good for the majority. They have some awareness of when they've gone too far or they're going too far. So, that's just me trying to wing it. But I think, in life, I think decent people just try to be good to other people to the best of their ability. Yeah. And we're human, so we can't always get it right, but I think we have some awareness and we try. Yeah. Yeah, Ethel. Mm. Uh-huh. Yes, it is interesting. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I The answer that comes to mind, if you were to pose the question to me, I think that the reason why white women are often referred to as ladies has to do with aristocratic British stuff. I'm thinking of, your talk with the Elizabethan period, and there was lady so-and-so, nobody was called woman so-and-so. I bet you that, I don't know, but I bet you that's where that comes from. It comes probably, yeah, yes. Yeah, I think I will do it again, because it was fun. Um, and I'm actually right now working on a thriller, actually. Yeah. So I do think I will play with genre, but I do consider myself primarily a character-driven writer. So I think any book I write, even if it's more murder mysteries, even if it's like a bloody thriller, I think that there's always going to be long stretches where we really get into a character's mind and learn why they are doing what they're doing, or running away from what they're running away from. I can't write like well, I don't know if Stephen King is a good example because his work is actually like literary thriller, but I can't just write a straight up slasher, like I'm interested in people's motivations and their backgrounds and that sort of thing. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. That's true. Where did you hear that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm giving the town of West Mills a break. At least that's the plan for now. I could change my mind after I write a draft, but I lived in New York for most of my adult life. And the last year that I was there, I was in upstate in a town called Saugerties. And it was an interesting little town. I mean, it was COVID and it was locked down, so we could only go to the grocery store and the gas station, But I lived on a little hamlet called Malden on Hudson. I called it Malden. I'm sorry. The true name is Malden on Hudson. I kept mispronouncing it as Malden. And every time I met a neighbor and I said, "Oh, I love it here on Malden," they would be like, "It's Malden," But it was like 15 houses or something like that. And it's right by the river, which I love because I could go and sit down and read, as long as I could stay in the cold. But what I learned when I was about to move, my landlord was giving one of his kids a birthday party, and he invited my partner and I to come. And almost everyone, I know that everyone had been invited, but a lot of people from the hamlet attended. And I just sort of watched and observed who spoke to who and who didn't speak, and the conversations that happened at the table. And I was like, oh God, my next book has to be set here. So yeah, that's the plan for now, to have a New York, but it's upstate, so it's not like in the city. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Any other? Yes. Sure, sure. Yeah, so In West Mills is largely a book about a lady named, her nickname is Knot, Knot, and she has an alcohol problem. And she has two children back to back, and she gives them away in sort of like an unofficial adoption to her neighbors. And the book takes big leaps in time. So, shortly after she has the two girls, we jump forward into the girls are teenagers, and they don't know who their mother, they don't know that this alcoholic, the town wino, is their birth mother, and she doesn't want them to know. So she's watching these girls grow up, and she sort of wants to be a mother to them. She wants to be hands off. She wants to be able to walk up to them and say, stop doing that, but I'm not your mom, so I'm not going to tell you what to do. So the book sort of follows her and her neighbor, Otis Lee. You see these two people get old. They're platonic friends, and he is sort of he's a big brother figure to her. But one of Knott's daughters, the second daughter, is Eunice from Decent People. Eunice is the lady who took her son to be de-gayed. And so that's sort of a big connection. But In West Mills is a lot about, both books are a lot about secrets, people keeping secrets from each other and from themselves. And then I think something I play with in West Mills especially is, when does the time come to release a secret? When is it in everyone's best interest for a secret to be told? Yeah. But yeah, Eunice and her family are probably the primary characters that carry over. Knot makes an appearance because this book goes back in time, a decade, but she makes a very brief appearance. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Mhm. You know what? I think I'm going to say subconscious at first, and then after I finished this book, I realized that I was intending to do something, and I think it comes from, I try not to write autobiographical work, but I think our lives slip into it, and my mother and I have a weird history, we're good now, but when I was younger, she was not happy with the fact that I'm gay at all, and I think that my father was I wouldn't say that he was the opposite, but he cared a little less, I think my dad was the type of person who sort of accepted that there are things we can change and there are things we can't, and my mother was like, he can be changed, she's not like that anymore, but at the time. And so I think that mother-son relationships, I think they come up because I'm constantly like, oh, I wish my mom and I had a better relationship when I was younger. And now she's like in her mid-70s, and and I just feel like we miss time. But she's still around. There's still time. But yeah, that's the reason why it shows up. In the next book, there is a mother-son relationship. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right, to close out this first morning session here today is our final author, who is a poet, a Mississippi native, and someone I have had the pleasure of calling friend for an undisclosed number of years. Kay Iver is a non-binary trans poet born in Mississippi, whose debut collection, short film starring My Beloved's Red Bronco, was awarded the 2022 Ballard Spar Prize for Poetry from Milkweed Editions. Their poems have appeared in Boston Review, Kenyon Review, Tri-Quarterly, and elsewhere. Iver has received fellowships from the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Helene Wurlitzer Foundation. With a PhD in poetry from Florida State University, they are currently the Roger F. Murray Chair in Creative Writing, serving as writer in residence at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. About short films starring My Beloved's Red Bronco, Sam Edge of Epilogue Books calls this a collection about a persistent grief so steady, so patient, that it grows dear. Iver's words are cinematic, their poems traceable stories by themselves that resonate and interact with each poem that follows it. Deepening that sentiment in her review, Mariah Rigg of Medium writes, "It is very rare to come across a book that both breaks your heart and mends it." And now to close out this morning's session, Kay Iver.
Hi, can you hear me? Good, okay. I like to read straight into the mic, but maybe I should, yeah, I don't know, come back a little. Kendall told me to talk right into the mic, but I'm hearing my consonants really loud. It's so wonderful to be here. Very sentimental for me. Yeah, it was exactly 20 years ago. I was in college and here you are. I guess high school. Many of you are in high school. Okay. All right. So this book, short film starring My Beloved's Red Bronco, was released in January, and it's my first book. I'm 41. I was 40 when the book came out. I've had a very, like Maurice, circuitous route to getting where I wanted to be. I grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, not very far, and I was the child of a secretary and a high school dropout. And I didn't know what literature was, really. I had Daniel Steele novels in my house. That was about it. But I started writing when I was 10. I started writing in my journal as prayers. I just wrote my prayers down. And that seemed to be still to me what poetry is. It's an attention, it's a searching, and a kind of experience, a cinematic experience, as Chris just said, distilled into an urgency. And these poems, many of these poems are, all of them are about having come of age in the 90s here in Mississippi as queer. And many of the poems pay tribute to my first love, who I met in a Tupelo High School courtyard when I was 14. And now we would say he was trans. We didn't really have that word in our lexicon back then, but I knew him for about 11 years. He died when I was 25 and he was 26. But we fell in love when I was 14 and he was 15. And my mother broke us up and I had to go to another school. I went to an evangelical school and I was very undereducated there about many things. And I was very lucky though, because they assigned the Scarlet Letter for me to read for a literature class. And I asked my dad one day, like, why we have to read these books when we have movies about them. I don't understand, like, you're making me read. And he said, because the way the words are put together. And that lit a light bulb in my head and it made me think about writing and literature in a very different way. And ever since, I've been on this journey of figuring out the mystery of how words are put together and what makes this sentence beautiful and this one I don't really want to read again. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, so that's a little bit about how I started to love writing, but it took me a long time and circumstantial changes to get here. Took a lot more time, energy, and resources. And I say that because, yeah, I don't know what backgrounds are here. I don't know what all intersections are here. And yeah, to just encourage you if you're writing, just to keep doing it. Just keep doing it. It doesn't really matter where you are or how many hours you're working in a day. Tomorrow may not be like today. So that to me is what hope is. All right. I'll just start reading some poems and maybe take one or two questions if there's time. This poem is called For Missy Who Never Got His New Name. I hear the stars are sentient, which gives me hope for the nitrogen feeding your grass. Even more for the mole ending the day's burrow in your skull. I'm told your atoms are still atoms. Somewhere you're sitting by a pool, picking apart the physics of swimming. In the hallway of a large high school in Mississippi, you're again the sophomore guarding my classroom entrance with a letter like an undiscovered prince. I've resumed my surprise at desire I thought was for cave dwellers. This is where I go wrong. I loved a body you didn't. My younger self wants the word to rebuild rather than stop at the blonde hair, middle part, low ponytail, the impressive manliness with which your hips carried utility denim. I tell my young self to flatten her memory's landscape. Picture two scars liberating a torso, a first name that doesn't hiss. Soon, a Brooklyn apartment. We pretend it finally happened for you. It really did. This one is called Tupelo, Mississippi, with the Tupelo crossed out. Crop dusters have gone missing. Storm clouds missing. Every owl has gone missing. Entire foothills. There are no dogwoods or foxes to miss them. Radio towers are missing. An archive has always been missing. Unmarked graves have not been missed, have been missed to death. Downtown is missing. The hardware store where Elvis bought his first guitar. The songs he robbed from juke joints. Original names for the dirt have been missing a long time. The namers have not been missed, have been missed terribly. A gospel just went missing. A gospel took all the blood it needed for its metaphor to work. My lover went missing today. My lover went missing 15 years ago. When neighbors spoke to him, they spoke to someone else. I found his old letters missing in their hot box. Each penciled word called from my mother's chimney. The brick said nothing. Right. This one's called Short Film Starring My Beloved's Living Body. Having been from Tupelo, often we'd escape to Memphis. Like that was our nice little getaway. If we were lucky, Jackson or New Orleans. In this case, it's Memphis. Open with the 2-lane highway, the ice truck and the ice, your elbow resting on the driver's side window. Zoom in on the toned forearm, the goldenrod rushing by. Missy, our audience can see you now. Show them the gas station delivery where a drunk lady screams about your good looks because there's no original way to say a man is beautiful, and the lady really did scream. Our audience will believe us, and they won't. They'll say people this lovely are only in films. No one with lips this pillowy needs to deliver ice. And here you are, lifting bags and saving up for a weekend in Memphis at the Motel 6. There's no time for dialogue about class or gender. No room to signal that your time with goldenrod is limited. Your time awake is limited. Look how awake you are. How the facial bones move with perfect alignment under the dermis. Got to the motel, leaving its light on for your red Bronco. Now the motel's dark interior. Now the bed nearest the window where you and a just out of high school date can finally make contact after years of parental imposed silence. I'm sorry. This film can't access your interior. Your date is the only one directing her memory. Your date is me. My memory is the shower scene, already zoomed in on your face. Open your eyes again. Look directly at me. Hold the camera's gaze through the falling water as if this were our last frame. Missy, this is our last frame. Body is the only good word for body. I'm afraid of home's hunger for yours, but off camera, the interstate is waiting and my lines are, let's go. This one's called Anti-Elegy, and to show off a little bit, it's in the shape of a river. There's like it's just gutted by white space. So more like a river on the map. If you were here, the Mississippi would still run south, would still drop its griefs into the Gulf where our friends would still swim in summer. Water would touch us like water. If you were here, the river that is your body would not move magically. While it emptied from the bladder's headwaters, from tear ducts and pores, public officials would still turn the fact of your body into arguments. You might have struck the impossible. Surgery, a new name, your own boat, and someone beautiful to name it after. Someone beautiful and their baby. From one dorm room landline to another, your wish list sounded like a fairy tale, like growing a merman's fin between glasses. I thought we were playing pretend when you said, "Good night, Tinkerbell," and I said the boy's name you wanted secret. Even then, strangers spoke to a boy when speaking to you. That was 20 years ago. The list already a plan, already gliding an undercurrent sprung 20 years before that. If you were here, still drinking cold tea in a cold diner, men in state capitol conference rooms, hours down the highway would still draft bathroom laws for adults. Your mother would still sneak taffeta and silk in your closet of fatigues and say she loved you. I wouldn't imagine your capillaries reassembling. If you were still dying like the rest of us, I wouldn't tell a young ghost how far we've come as if I believed how far we've come was enough. Wouldn't worry about who else gets more than 27 years. Your body wasn't a national average. You wanted more than safety. But I didn't wake sore in the jaw. until I heard the numbers, until a nation, an entire nation, couldn't offer an alibi. Missy, my grief is righteous and problematic. It floods the last four walls holding you and begs for time. It hurls absurd reasons from a future. A handful of trans film stars humanizing a handful of trans characters. Better doctors. My grief says it's helping, but argues only for me. The relief, the microsecond of relief, when I achieve the unexpected and hope you find out. This means I forget you're gone. That this makes my grief a loose dam. Still, I talk to water that unrivered your body for dirt. I float fantasies of dirt that holds us up longer. I say to the water, if you were here, you'd be here. Okay. Thank you for holding out this long. I'll read another one about place, and I want to begin with a little caveat that I no longer think a whole place is bad. But a little trick to get through grief is to kind of externalize and project villains everywhere. It does help for a little while. And I want to dedicate this one to Megan's half-sister, Jessica. This is called Mississippi Missing Missy Miss. July 2007. I drive from the graveside to my apartment, 59 miles from your body. Your villain has yet to go public. She's larger than the highway. She says to keep your name quiet, and I bury each holy letter in the undergalaxy of dreams. In the car, I scream for a raccoon failing to lift his own body with his tail. A grief more bearable than getting lost in the dual image of you squatting in the gym one day and dangling from a light fixture the next. At home, I begin playing videos of a cow weeping for her child who's left the pasture to become veal. I think maybe their villain is the grass in their bellies. In my dreams, you call from the decade-old landline that held our breaths until 3 a.m. There, I can see you leaning on the blue wall, saying you're alive and so sorry. In the daylight, I drive an earless cat home from the highway, juggle this new obsession with non-humans alongside the old obsession with people who insist on my wanting them until I do. I do not believe you are here now and so sorry. I believe the soreness of each woman you collected is worth your warm, above ground body collecting more women. That is to say, I am inconsolable. Every day, a new definition of inconsolable. Yesterday, I have a body and you don't. Today, your villain is a place. Okay. I'll read one of, that is another trick for getting through grief. When you're starting to come on the other side of it is I think of it as a reverse pregnancy, where, you know, how a lot of people who are pregnant say, I'm eating for two, I'm drinking for two. It's like, oh yeah. I think of that in terms of joy now. So I try to seize the day for two. Yeah. This is called Because You Can't, comma. Because you can't. I stand in front of paintings a long time and think about the bones once belonging to you and how Egon Schiele could line a body into movement. Because you no longer have a shape, I've made a practice of nearness. A hawk lets me stroke her mid-flight. I let comments land in my mouth when they're small enough. My lover pushes all their weight on me because I asked. They flatten me into astonishment. Because nothing can astonish you, I tempt what's alive by doubting I could love it more. It's a neat trick. When I use it, raccoons visit often, their fingers closed around mud older than you. Missy, this is me moving on. There's a noon rain to get caught in and many clavicles to behold. I wish you could see this one, tilting across a century. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Any time for questions, Chris, or should I step down? Okay. Any questions? About poems or writing or plays? Yeah. Yeah, it's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, of course, when I landed and I saw the landscape, I had some body memories, and then I saw some writers, and then I was fine. Yeah, and I recently came back for the Mississippi Book Festival and have realized more and more just how much I would have probably done better here if I had access to the radical South. Yeah, I keep meeting more queer people and people of different intersections who are engaged in, actual action. And but I didn't have access to that growing up here. I mean, my grandfather was the vice chairman of the Mississippi Republicans in the 60s. Like, like that, those are my people, unfortunately. And yeah, and I think it has healed my relationship with it to not only meet people who don't vote against my safety constantly here, to study the history of radicalism in the South. And the most radical movements I could think of started here, i.e. slave rebellions, right? And there's this book out of I think the University of Mississippi Press, called Lesbians of the South. And it's an academic book, but it's a historical rendering of queer activism here. And all of this has really helped me kind of ease those body memories a little bit, But yeah, but for a while, there are a lot of fairy tale poems in the book, or poems inspired by fairy tales. And the fairy tale is great for the initial stages of grief, where people are good and bad, and there's no complexity. And there are villains, and there are, evil witches, and there are good witches, and yeah. And as we become adult, or as I reach an adult stage of like parenting these wounded younger children inside of me, that is where I've gotten in that. Yes, there was a lot of violence and brutality here, and there is so much beauty and goodness and connection that I have experienced just in the last 24 hours. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's such a good question. I don't like to give advice. And I don't argue with anyone's despair, or I make a point to never argue with that, or decisions we make in response to marginalization here. But I want you to stay. I hope you stay. stay in your body, stay alive. If it, you have, days that make that hard, just stay and hang on to each other for dear life. I mean, that's what I did with the people who loved me here. Is I had very codependent communities, and that helped me get through. It's easy, especially when you're young, to find out, how you're different than your friends, and have divisions. And studies show that the queer community does this more than any other demographic. Is we are very catty with each other, and we're not as nice to each other. So I would say, love your friends, be nice to them. Any other? Yeah. You. Mm-hmm. I think I had trouble hearing your last sentence. I think I had trouble hearing your last sentence. Yeah. Uh-huh. Of course, yeah. 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 I mean, that's what you see in the Holocaust Museum before you see anything. You see the history of how, um, you know, um, an entire demographic was talked about. Yeah. I mean, that's just one example I'm thinking off the top of my head. And we're seeing that also, about the Palestinians, calling them human animals. Yeah. And it's scary. It's scary what we do with language. Yeah. Christy? Yeah, I needed to leave Mississippi. I needed to get out of survival mode. I was working class, and I needed to not be working 13-hour days and coming home and writing 3 hours or 3 words before falling asleep. Yeah, and I needed that. I needed some comfort, sleep. I needed to travel. I needed to see more of the world. I had always wanted to travel in undergrad, and had watched my friends go to Europe and backpack and foam at the mouth. And yeah, I needed more opportunities, to see Mississippi as, not so big. Yeah, because I knew it wasn't, but I needed to understand that by, going to Vienna and seeing Egon Schiele paintings that I'd always wanted to see, and thinking about, how to write about it in the way that hopefully, like, I was much more inspired, for instance, than by how Kiese Lemon writes about Mississippi than how many people write about the South in general. I love how he doesn't try to make the landscape more beautiful than it is, or the events more beautiful than they are, right? He's showing you exactly what he sees, and his language makes you want to keep looking at it with him. I think being away and then reading stuff by Kiese really helped me get the guts to be really real about how I felt about this place. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Postmortem what? Puppy love? Yeah. Mhm. Love this person? Oh, um, the older I get, the less I know what love is, especially in the Eros realm. Like yeah, because I still love like that. I still, love as if it's the first time. And um, yeah, I think um, it wasn't a relationship where I saw him every day, right? But but his memory was really important. He was the first example for me of something else to be, outside of the very high femme performance that I lived for so long. And he planted that seed very young. And so archetypally, yes, I loved a lot that was there. And after he died, it became more kind of an agape love. It was like a higher power in a way. If we think of these poems as prayer, I'm definitely reaching and searching and wanting more. I mean, there's a poem about having visited a medium and her knowing all kinds of stuff that I had never told anyone, and wanting to believe these, in the supernatural. And yeah, so, but love, yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what love is anymore. If that makes sense. But he is an important memory for me, and it's one that I call on in my hardest and happiest moments. So yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I love how one thing I do love about Mississippi is how much we talk. And yeah, I think that might have helped with wanting a discernible voice on the page, because that's the most important thing to me. I want it to sound like someone is talking, and someone who sounds distinct, like themselves, a voice that knows itself. But a more important thing, what's your name? Savannah. One of the things, Savannah, is that I want anyone to be able to read what I'm writing. And I don't think you need to sacrifice beauty and style for that. I want you to be able to read it, if no matter where you are on the neurodivergent spectrum. If you're hungover, strung out, or even drunk, you're having a dark night of the soul and you have a hard time focusing, I want you to be able to access what I'm saying. And that's really, really important to me. Yeah. So that's underneath the style more than anything, a kind of disability justice poetics. Yeah. Any other? Am I done? Hey, all right. Thank you all so much. It's been great.
Well, let's keep doing that right there. One more round of applause for all of our first four authors this morning and this morning's session. A reminder that there are still two more sessions to come, one this afternoon and one tomorrow morning. And a further reminder that all of the books featured here at the symposium are available for purchase out in the lobby, and the writers are also available to autograph those books for you, although they are not themselves available for purchase as far as I know. But for now, we will break for lunch with one last reminder to please fill out the evaluations that you'll find in your programs. Thank you for joining us this morning, and the next session begins in here at 1:30.